and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 565, Riot Girls. There's a bit of a coda, a related but distinct story to rioting in the Edo period that I want to touch on before we leave this subject behind. I'd initially planned to incorporate it into the previous episodes, but on balance felt there just wasn't enough space to do that productively, and besides, it's a pretty interesting story and deserves airtime in its own right. You see, keen-eared listeners will note that in the last 3 weeks, one part of the Edo period social order has been conspicuously absent in our discussion of social disruption. We haven't really talked about the role of women in street riots or any sort of social disruption, which is conspicuous to say the least, given that, they make up half of any given society. Of course, during the Edo period, women did operate under pretty strict rules that limited their access to the public sphere. In the sphere of women's history, the age of the Tokugawa shoguns from 1600 to the mid-1800s was defined by the philosophy of Neo-Confucianism. This was a philosophy originating during the Song dynasty of imperial China, created by scholars looking to systematize Confucianism into a sort of all-encompassing philosophy. They wanted to create a worldview that didn't just provide thoughts on Confucius's primary interests, morality, family, government, the relationship between the three, but which would give answers for other questions ranging from the religious to the aesthetic to the social. The closest comparison, if you're familiar with European history, would probably be the scholastic philosophy of the medieval Catholic Church, with its fusion of Aristotelian Greek philosophy and Christian doctrine, created by Thomas Aquinas and refined by his successors, into a consistent worldview. This modified Confucianism is what we call Neo-Confucianism, and over the centuries it became the dominant government-endorsed orthodox philosophy in both the dynasties of imperial China and their satellite kingdoms like Korea. In Japan, Neo-Confucianism had an intellectual presence for much of the Middle Ages, but it never came to dominate in the same way it did on the mainland, not unusual given how divided and decentralized Japanese government and society were. When the Tokugawa shogunate rose to power in the early 1600s, Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors did promote some Neo-Confucian scholars into their inner circle, most notably the samurai and scholar Hayashi Razan, founder of the Hayashi school of Confucian thought. This official support did give the Neo-Confucians more influence, but again, they never became as dominant an intellectual force in Japan as their counterparts on the Asian mainland. Still, Neo-Confucian discourse did do a lot to shape discussions around the social role of women in particular, because unlike Confucius himself, who doesn't really mention women at all in the works attributed to him, Neo-Confucians had a lot to say on the subject of female propriety. And what, pray tell, did they have to say? Well, here I am required to point to one of the major texts of Japanese Neo-Confucianism on this subject, Onna Daigaku, or the Greater Learning for Women, produced in the late 1600s by the Neo-Confucian scholar Kaibara Ekken. Kaibara took it upon himself to create what you might call social manuals for people of different stations or positions, intended to instruct them in correct behavior, but his work on the social status and behavior of women is particularly infamous. That's because Kaibara lays out a worldview of female subordination to men, with women's lives contained solely in the private sphere, and dominated by a feudalistic mindset that treats loyalty to the husband and, if he dies, to adult sons, as an extension of the feudal obligations between a samurai and his master. Kaibara's worldview was not exceptional for his period. The laws of the shogunate were constructed around this worldview pretty explicitly. Women were legally subordinated to the men leading their households, their fathers, husbands, or eldest sons based on age, and could not, for example, own property outside of their clothing and whatever they brought with them into a marriage during this period. They were obligated to follow the public lead of men, who also dominated the leadership positions within communities, all decisions of substance made by community leaders, so these would be neighborhood chiefs in the cities and village headmen in the countrysides, sometimes made in consultation with heads of household. Well, these would all be men. Of course, we've seen in some past episodes, most notably episode 356, which was focused primarily on the lives of women in Edo period Japan, that the official status of women didn't necessarily reflect reality. First, the shogunate's laws were generally focused the most on the behavior of the most influential social class, the samurai. Women in that social class saw their lives much more carefully regulated, not least of all because in an age when politics was still a family sport, their marriages could serve as the basis for potentially threatening political alliances. Outside of the warrior class, however, non-samurai were largely left to manage their own devices. And while there was a broad notion that propriety among women should be enforced, the shogunate was pretty hands-off on that issue, as it was with basically everything else related to commoners other than paying your taxes. Second, women could and did find ways to circumvent these rules restricting their public agency, usually through the help of the men in their lives, whose support could allow them access to, say, a job as a tutor or a maid that would give them a degree of independence. And of course, some women just ignored what their families told them to do and lived on their own terms. Tsuneno, the woman whose life is the focus of episode 456, is one such example. She literally ran off to Edo to escape her family. But even with this knowledge, it's very hard to reconstruct the lives of Edo period women in a meaningful way, particularly around the questions of the law and violations of it. This is for two reasons. First, to paraphrase the modern-day scholar Morosawa Yoko, the Neo-Confucian attitude towards women both denigrated women as less than men, and kind of simultaneously exonerated them from ever getting in trouble for breaking the rules. After all, if you're a staunch Neo-Confucian, you genuinely believe that women just follow the lead of the men in their lives. And if that's true, anything the women do that's wrong is the fault of the men, not of the women. Indeed, in a very real sense, women were not legal persons in the Edo period social order. Notions of female propriety, for example, meant their names did not appear on any public-facing official documents most of the time. The use of a personal name for a woman as opposed to some sort of title or relationship with a man, the daughter of so-and-so, the wife of thus and such, was considered immodest. This is why the best documentary record we do have for women during this period tends to come from personal records, letters, diaries, that sort of thing, rather than public records around taxation, census-taking, legal judgments. Second, because women were regarded ideally as wholly private individuals without a public life to speak of, they tend to appear very irregularly, if at all, in any sort of official records from the period. That's all the more true in cases involving riots or other disturbances, where the shogunate often suppressed any discussion at all of events that seemed to undermine its legitimacy or perceived power. There were limits on these restrictions, of course, depending on time and place. Some villages, for example, allowed widowed women to represent themselves at communal meetings that otherwise would have been barred from. But most of the time, in most places, the feudal order of the Tokugawa regime treated women as inherently apolitical and non-public, entirely private persons with no public function to speak of. But of course, that can't really be true. And when we think about the questions of popular protest or rioting, it raises a really interesting question. What can we know about how and when the women of the commoner classes involved themselves in these things? It's of course a really interesting question in its own right as part of the social history of the period. It's also really fascinating in terms of thinking about how, as historians, we tackle these sort of challenging questions when, for example, the historical records on the ground are very thin. When the social structure of the period means you aren't going to find good sources that give you something really direct to work with. How do you write a good story in that case? It's a really interesting problem and a fun one to explore when it comes up. So, let's dive in. And very quickly, as we look at the historical record, we do find that there are a few places where women appear in stories of popular protest or discontent. And by the way, I want to note that I'm drawing very heavily here from Anne Walthall's excellent essay, Devoted Wives, Unruly Women, which is a fascinating treatment of this period. One of the first places Walthall points to look is in narratives of local legends. often preserved by local samurai or officials at major shrines and temples, or just local wealthy peasants with some spare time and an interest in local history. These people would construct histories of their regions, asking around about common local legends and stories and writing down what they heard, and they give us at least some window into the stories people told themselves to make sense of their regions and their world. And women do appear in these stories in moments of riot and protest, but in what we might call a restricted manner. Take, for example, one of the most famous peasant narratives of the entire period, the legend of Sakura Sogoro. So this is a story that was in its day very famous and is still pretty decently well known today, and also in large part because of how famous the story is, it's basically impossible to verify any of the details. The legend goes that Sogoro, whose actual family name was Kyuchi, was from a peasant family in Sakura Domain, one of the feudal domains of the Tokugawa era that was located in what was then Shimosa Province. It's now Chiba Prefecture on the east end of the greater Tokyo metro area. He was born sometime in the early 1600s. I see 1605 as a commonly given date, but I have no idea where people get that number from. To a prominent family in his village of farmers, Kozu Village, Inaba County. It's now part of the city of Narita. At the time, Sakura Domain was ruled by the Hotta family, a samurai family closely aligned to the then ruling Tokugawa shoguns. The domain had been their reward for their loyal service, but the second Hotta lord of Sakura Domain, Hotta Masanobu, was a terrible and greedy ruler who jacked up taxes and made the lives of the peasants unbearable. Normally, of course, the recourse for village headmen who felt their people were being ill-treated would be to complain to the proper authorities and ask for relief, but in this case, the proper authorities were Lord Hotta and his underlings, who were, of course, not predisposed to complaints that they were being greedy and unfair. And so Sogoro took it upon himself to break the law by complaining directly to the shogun, which was an extreme violation of the laws governing samurai-commoner relations. You are not supposed to go over the head of your local lord. For this violation of the law, he was condemned to death. The legend first became widely known because of a local history, the Soyo Gairyoku, compiled in 1715, which claimed that Sogoro died vowing to curse Lord Hotta and his followers from the afterlife. When Hotta Masanobu was subsequently relieved of his lordship and placed under house arrest in 1660, it was seen as the result of the curse created by Sogoro's death. He had, the theory went, become an onryo, a vengeful spirit, in his passing. And so a shrine to his memory was constructed inside the local Buddhist temple of Toshoji to pacify his spirit. It still exists today, actually, and holds a commemorative event on September 2nd every year, the anniversary of his execution. Now, here's the thing with this story: how true any of the Sakura Sogoro narrative is remains a bit contentious. For a time, it was suspected the whole thing was an invention, but some parts of the story have been corroborated by modern scholarship. For example, the Kozu village household register did include a wealthy farmer by the name of Sogoro, and Kozu itself was resurveyed in the 1650s, to increase its taxes and then broken up into 5 different villages shortly thereafter, the sort of thing you might do if, say, the locals were getting uppity in order to divide and conquer them, making them easier to manage. But even things like the exact year of Sogoro's supposed death remain a bit hard to pin down. I've, again, seen a few different ones, though 1653 is the most common one. But what matters to us is that after the publication of that local history that first included the Sogoro story in 1715, the legend became hugely popular. It was reprinted in books, in print. It became part of kabuki plays, the most famous being Sakura Giminden, or The Legend of the Righteous Man from Sakura. All these different narratives and histories differ in the details because, of course, for the most part, those writing them cared more about producing something entertaining and edifying than being accurate. And some of these narratives give Sogoro a wife and children, and to be fair, the most common chronology for his life would put him in his late 40s or early 50s when he died, so he probably was married and had some kids. But the figure of Osan, the name commonly given to his wife, appears to be a dramatic invention. In many versions of the story, she, along with her sons, is executed next to Sogoro as a warning to future violators of the law. One version of the story from the 1850s had Osan vowing at the moment of her death to return alongside her husband and haunt the Hotta family, not because of her husband's death or her own, but to avenge her children. In other words, her vengeance, which the audience was supposed to approve of, took place in the context of her role in the family for private reasons, not because, like her husband, she objected to the public immorality of Lord Hotta. Sogoro is the most famous of the Edo period gimin, peasant martyrs who stood up to mistreatment at the hands of unaccountable samurai. And the women who appear in these narratives all get pretty much the same treatment as Osan. For example, take another peasant martyr story of Takanashi Riemon, who lived in what was then Yonezawa domain of Dewa province. Now it's part of Yonezawa city in Yamaguchi prefecture, on the north end of Honshu. All these peasant martyr stories tend to be very similar. In this case, the ruling family is the Uesugi family of feudal lords. Yes, that Uesugi family, if you know your 1500s history, they've become corrupt, they're overtaxing people. Other than that, the story is basically identical. Takanashi is a local village headman. He takes it upon himself to protest to the shogun, knowing that it would lead to his death, but hoping it would draw attention to the plight of his people. And in the local histories of Yonezawa, to the extent that Takanashi's wife even shows up in the narrative, it is as a secondary character. She doesn't even get a name in the story. She's just Takanashi's wife, and exists only to weep over the death of her husband and how this will affect the family. And this is played in these stories as understandable, because it is, supposedly, the role of women, their social obligation to care about these things. But it's also fundamentally less noble than Takanashi, who weeps for the suffering of all and is thus willing and able to nobly self-sacrifice. One of the clearest examples, in my opinion, of the role women play in these local histories comes from an account of the so-called Sanhei Uprising, which took place in 1853 in the northern domain of Nambu, in what's now Iwate and Akita prefectures in northern Honshu. The rebellion, shockingly, was driven by, wait for it, overtaxation, and swept through 3 counties in the domain, Kunohei, Shimohei, and Kamihei. The name Sanhei literally means 3 heis, which is how those counties were referred to collectively. The Sanhei Rebellion is actually really interesting in its own right, and I might do an episode just on it in the future, but for now the important thing to note is that in common tellings of the rebellion, one of the characters is the wife of a peasant leader, but of course she's known only as Magokichi's wife. And she's recorded as telling her husband before the climactic events, quote, "This resolve of yours is completely useless. If you are arrested, you will be severely punished, causing your children endless grief. I beg you please to give up your plans if you have any thought of the future." In her essay, Walthall notices that these representations of women serve a few different roles in the narrative of peasant rebellion. I'm going to quote here directly from her work. First, they said what men could not, but within the confines of the home. Second, they supplement a focus on conflict between peasants and the authorities, as individuals less concerned with community than with family. Drawing on the social conventions of the time, these texts depicted women whose responses to their husbands' predicaments sprang from human feeling, an imperative that at moments of crisis could complicate the standards of conduct for public behavior. Walthall then goes on to note that the whole narrative structure is reflective of a classic trope of Japanese literature, a split between giri, obligation, and ninjo, or private feeling. In other words, men were depicted as hewing to their communal obligations, self-sacrifice for the benefit of others, while women gave voice to an understandable desire to reject that role. But what made the men heroes in this particular narrative structure was the rejection of that urge and an embrace of the obligation towards community and towards sacrifice. Even when women did defy the authorities in these legends, it was often in ways less direct than men. For example, a woman named Otsuta appears in the narrative in another peasant uprising in Nambu domain in the 1820s. Nambu actually had more of these than any other domain, for some interesting reasons that we don't have time to get into. Anyway, Otsuda's father was one of the instigators of the rebellion and was sentenced to be beheaded. Hearing of the sentence, she dressed herself all in white with a white headband, a color associated with death in Japan, similar to the associations black has in the West, and she made her way to the execution grounds to offer herself up to die in her father's place. But on the way, she faltered in her resolve, and so arrived just after the killing blow fell. To quote Walthall's analysis of the legend, quote, "This woman was not brave in the way that men were brave, for she never confronted the authorities with demands that could be construed as political, nor did she take a leadership role like, say, Jeanne d'Arc. Furthermore, women who were willing to sacrifice themselves for their menfolk did so at the level of the family. Not for them was the masculine role of self-sacrifice." Defiance was always limited. For example, one legend from Shikoku depicted a man named Shinnojo who was executed for leading a peasant protest in 1770. And that legend includes the detail that his severed head was left exposed to humiliate him after death and as a warning to his followers. His wife, of course known only as Shinnojo's wife, could not bear it, and so stole his head from the display every night for 7 nights to take it to a local temple and perform funeral rites for it, only to return it at the end of each night so the authorities would be none the wiser. Other similar stories involve women stealing their dead husbands' heads outright to bury them. These women are all defying the authorities, but they're doing it for reasons of family and personal feeling. It's not political, it's about their obligation to another person within their family unit. In other words, all these stories of female defiance actually reflect the gender dynamics of mainstream thinking about women during the Tokugawa period, because, of course they did. All these local historians or writers or kabuki theater troupes were dominated by men. And so the women who appear in these stories are reflections of male fantasy. These women are always, in other words, conforming to the standards men imposed on them, even when they were engaged in behavior that violated the law. To the extent they were allowed to defy their traditional roles, it was only to give voice to emotions and feelings, the desire to live, to focus on family continuity, that men, because of their public duty, couldn't express. But Dr. Walthall also notes that the rate at which women appear in these local histories or kabuki plays or whatnot to reinforce their traditional social role as the guardian of the family in the private space seems to go up over the course of the Tokugawa period. In other words, these sorts of stories are more frequent in the written record in 1850 than they are in 1650. And that's really fascinating because from economic records of the period, we can tell that women were becoming increasingly economically independent over the course of the Tokugawa years. Most of Japan's population, remember, is rural during the Edo period, and as the centuries of peace wore on and the economy grew, agriculture became commercialized. The growing of cash crops, silk, tobacco, the varieties of rice best suited for sake, that sort of thing, could make a peasant family very wealthy, and so these households had a lot of incentive to bring anyone they could, including women, into the workforce. And the impact of this increasingly commercial economy was uneven to say the least, and given the record-keeping of the time, it's hard to get really precise documentation on how it affected the lives of women. But it's clear that at least for wealthier peasant families, commercialized agriculture meant that by the end of the Edo period, more women were doing labor outside of the house, brewing sake, selling silk, working as maids in the big city when you get to places like Edo than ever before, and as a result, they were earning independent wages. And Dr. Walthall suggests this might be part of the reason why all these tales emphasizing the traditional role of women proliferated over the course of the period. They were reflections of male anxiety about increasing female independence, and were an attempt to essentially missionize to these women, to teach them how they were supposed to be. So this is probably giving you a sense of how challenging it can be to talk about women's roles in any sort of rule-breaking during the Edo period based on these folktales and histories. Unfortunately, our other main source of information is just as hard to make use of, albeit for different reasons. These would be the fragmentary primary records we do have from women who protested government policies or appealed to agents of the government for intervention personally. These records are, of course, tricky to use, both because they are fragmentary by nature, they don't tend to offer a lot of context, and because the women who are writing them were, of course, not trying to be honest about how they felt. They were trying to be persuasive towards a bunch of powerful men. It's also important to note that most women had no legal standing to appeal to the authorities for any reason during the Edo period. Edo period Japan operated in a legal framework where individuals, in the modern sense, didn't have legal standing. The law operated on a household basis, with the household head, the oldest male in the family, serving as both the legal guardian of everyone in the family, responsible for guiding them and for taking the fall if anyone broke the rules, and for representing the needs of the family to the appropriate legal authorities should that be necessary. As long as there were basically any males in the family who were not literal infants, women could not serve as a household head. Over the course of the Tokugawa years, the number of women who did take on the position of family head did go up, mostly because birth rates fell a lot during the Tokugawa years as the population stabilized, and because, particularly in the later decades, a great many men illegally migrated to cities to find better paying jobs than were available for a farmer. But even so, the number of women who were in a position to even petition the authorities at all remained pretty low. Most of the petitions we do have are appeals for clemency after a riot or other violation of the law by male heads of household. These could be, to say the least, extremely fraught for women trying to make them, because remember, if they were in a position to act as family head and send a petition saying, "Please don't kill my husband or brother or son or what have you," that meant there were no men around to do it for them. And that in turn meant there was nobody around who could continue the family line, a male who could inherit the family name and continue it into the future. And keep in mind, maintaining the family line is the basic imperative of the family group as a whole. In other words, these were women whose families were facing the very real possibility of legal annihilation after their own deaths. And so it makes sense most of the appeals we have are focused on trying to get clemency for men, which would allow those men to return home and maintain the existence of their own family. These petitions thus tend to emphasize female weakness and the need for men to sustain themselves. As an example, take a group of 4 women whose husbands were exiled after protesting tax policies in what's now Saitama Prefecture in 1764. They wrote to the local magistrate, quote, "We hesitated to make this appeal, but we are all so weak we cannot maintain our livelihoods." And this worked, actually, in this case. Whether or not these women believed that they could not survive without men is, of course, open to questioning, but clearly they knew what they had to say to convince a magistrate. There are some appeals for clemency from women that are a bit more interesting to look at because the women do not play directly to the stereotypes of weakness and submission to convince men. The most notable is from 1772, written by Soyo, the wife of a village headman whose name was Sanai. Sanai was the headman of a village called Kanaodani in what's now Chiba Prefecture. He was one of 3 headmen who, during a particularly bad planting season, had petitioned on behalf of their villages to the local lord for a loan of seed rice to get them back on their feet. That petition was apparently a bit unwelcome because Sanai was executed for it. Soyo then petitioned the local magistrate to the effect that the decision was very unfair, and you really gotta admire the courage that takes given what happened to her husband. Her specific issue was that her husband alone had been executed, not the other 2 headmen who'd been involved. Sanai had been determined to be the leader of the conspiracy to take inappropriate demands to the local government. Soyo's brother, the 2nd headman, had merely been imprisoned. The 3rd one had gone unpunished. Soyo insisted that this was unfair and that the men from the 3rd village had bribed local samurai and manufactured evidence to push all the responsibility for the petition onto Soyo's brother and to Sanai to avoid punishment. She said she knew this, quote, "without a doubt," though she did also throw in a caveat that because I am a woman, I do not know the law. Unfortunately, Soyo herself passed shortly after writing her appeal. However, her mother-in-law and stepdaughters managed to pursue the case, and a local senior counselor listened to them and investigated independently. He found that everything Soyo said was true, and punished both the leader of the 3rd village and the samurai who'd helped him, restoring Sanae and Soyo's family's legal rights as well. In gratitude, the local villagers helped farm the family lands and gave the profit to the family daughters. Soyo's case is really interesting because she doesn't try to hide her knowledge of local politics or play the part of a weak and helpless woman, at least not beyond a very basic and superficial level, necessary to avoid the appearance of impropriety. She's very direct about what she knows, and it's pretty clear she was involved in some of these discussions. Unfortunately, sources that are this direct are comparatively rare, but they are interesting reads nonetheless. And we do occasionally see women crop up in other petitions in ways that make it clear they certainly did break the rules when it suited them. One favorite of mine from 1846 accuses a woman known as Senemon's wife of constantly stealing radishes and millet from other families to feed her own. Another from the 1840s accused Chubei's sister of disrupting the local village activities by being too loud, also claiming that, quote, although she is a woman, she is always meddling in all sorts of matters, and she says more than she should even at the government offices. These types of complaints are pretty rare. One imagines that most of the time, that sort of thing would be handled between family heads, meaning there was no documentation of it. But they, along with Soyo's petition, serve as a reminder that the historical record we have of all these well-behaved women who only broke the rules for the right reasons is clearly a construct created by men, not to reflect reality, but to reflect their views on how reality should be. Now, keen-eared listeners will note one thing I haven't really talked about here is women being directly complicit in the larger Ushikawashi, the rice riots that racked big cities like Edo. We've talked about women breaking the law, or being tangentially involved in law breaking, but what about these big moments of social disruption? And here again, the historical record is thin, but suggestive. For example, most of the records of the 1787 rice riot that racked the city of Edo don't mention women being involved at all, except for a brief mention in the diary of the novelist Takizawa Bakin. He noted that after rioters smashed up rice shops, quote, wives, old women, and young girls of the poor mingled with child beggars to pick up the grain. Nobody else observing the riots, and as you might recall from past weeks we have a lot of observations, remarked on this. Takizawa only talks about it passingly. When you think about it, that's kind of suggestive. It makes it seem like this sort of thing was common enough to be considered unremarkable. It also makes a certain amount of sense from what we know of the social roles of the period. If women were, in the structures of the Edo period, expected to manage the household, it makes sense they'd be the ones taking charge of collecting and dividing up looted food from the riots. But again, we can only make inferences here. We don't have direct documentation. Still, it seems to fit the information we do have, because there are a few scattered records of women taking the lead in driving food riots, albeit not in Edo. The 1787 riots, after all, were not just in the capital city. That same famine affected the Kansai area, and in the same year, a group of 300 women from Kamikori village, just outside Kyoto, marched on the office of the local Amagasaki domain to demand food relief, claiming, they said, their husbands were too busy working for food to make the appeals themselves. Their numbers, of course, were an implied threat, 300 people showing up at an office to petition all at once, and in neighboring Hayashida domain, the threat was a bit more explicit. The women there gathered at the home of the senior village headman, also the wealthiest man in the village, to demand food aid. When said headman wouldn't give it, the women jeered until their menfolk showed up too, and they then proceeded to burn that guy's house to the ground. The whole group then marched on Hayashida Castle and actually briefly succeeded in laying siege to it before the local lord offered them food relief. These sorts of scenes suggest the power women could wield in mobilizing men around the issue of food, which, after all, was the ultimate family concern and thus, at least from a certain perspective, fell within the range of action they were supposed to take. A similar incident took place in Kanazawa in 1836, when a group of women protested for lower food prices outside the homes of rice merchants until local men took it upon themselves to rip those homes down and take the food they needed. And in 1858, the entirety of Kaga province on the Japan Sea coast was racked by a series of incidents one historian called the Housewives' Riot. Over the span of the summer of 1858, thousands of women took to the streets in the villages of Kaga, and in one case they surrounded the castle of the local lord to shout their pleas at him. A few riots in the village resulted, the largest being in the village of Korimi, and extremely unusually for the period, a woman named Sanno was one of the instigators, labeled as a peasant leader in the aftermath of the riots and punished for her outrageous deeds. These incidents are all suggestive. They're also very different from documented food riots in the West. In those cases, women were pretty clearly at the forefront. Women led a lot of the rioting in Paris in 1789 that would eventually help bring down the old regime and inaugurate the French Revolution. In both the March and October revolutions of 1917 in Russia, women started things off by demanding peace, land, and bread very publicly. By contrast, given the thousands of documented food-related disturbances in the countryside, hundreds in the city during the Edo period, women don't appear that much. And that's really strange, because the social role of women in Edo period Japan isn't that different from traditional Western societies like pre-revolutionary France or Tsarist Russia. Does that reflect, as many scholars have long assumed, a less political role for Japanese women during the period? Does it reflect, as Dr. Walthall suggests, a concern among male diarists and writers of the period to avoid too much mention of anything that could be considered improper being done by women? Too many mentions of behaviors that could be considered boundary pushing. And here is where we run up against the historical wall, and ultimately I think it's an interesting point to end this whole conversation on. Barring the discovery of radically new documentation, we're probably not going to get a clean answer to this question, so how you answer it is going to depend on the assumptions you come in with about people and how we on average tend to relate to social roles that we find confining. I personally think Dr. Walthall has it right. In my experience, people conform to the norms laid out for them only to the extent they either feel those norms are justified or fear punishment for breaking them. And in many cases, I suspect the women of the Edo period were not too concerned about either of those things when you really got up against it. But again, there's just no real way to be sure. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support us on Patreon. Special thanks to new patron Alex for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for something very different, the exploration of post-war Japan through biography.